It's time to talk Formula One. The 2014 F1 cars have launched. They ran their first test at Jerez, and thanks to the new technical regulations and new technologies, our 2014 Shakedown debut show on the Tudor Championship in the Daytona 24, well, that show ran longer than the 2014 cars ran on the Jerez track. Yeah, shaking down new equipment is a process, and it does seem that Renault, for example, has a glitch to fix, but like Bernie Ecclestone and his team of attorneys fighting back on their troubles, Renault has its experts on the case. And do you really think Infiniti Red Bull Racing and Vettel are not going to be a factor this year? Today we'll take a shakedown look at F1 2014 and provide a heads up on what to look for once the racing starts in March the 14th through 16th in Australia. But like last week, rather than listen to some internet genius go at it, dissecting these new F1 technologies and driving challenges, I'm Skyping today with another one of Shakedown's go-to experts, Allan McNish. He just got a gig on BBC as one of their F1 broadcast authorities, so he can warm up here with us. But the real reason I want to hear from Allan, besides his F1 experience and his overall knowledge of all things racing, is this. Thanks to his Audi e-tron Quattro driving experience, in my opinion, he probably knows more than the current F1 pilots about how to drive these new, complex energy recovery systems and V6 turbos. So come back and we'll get the download on the cars, the technology, the teams, and the racers. What to watch for, who'll be hot, and what will be what the for everyone else who's not winning. And I use the F word inspired by the way a few of these race cars look. And while I told you I don't do dick jokes, I can tell you that to cover these anatomically shaped cars, I'm wearing a condom. So Allan, if you join us anymore on Shakedown, we're going to have to start paying you, but since they don't pay me, I don't know what to tell you on that one. And I wore as much Scottish clothes as I could for my wardrobe, okay?
I do like the tie, I've got to say, but does that mean the invoices that I've been sending you all this time aren't going to be paid? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, we're using them as coasters for all the drinking here.
Well, I was a bit worried about all what's on the desk there, because the last time I saw that sort of information there, it was when I was at school and I was getting a telling off for my report card. I hope that's not the case.
Well, now that you're the BBC F1 authoritative, joining, I guess, Eddie Jordan and David and Susie Perry and such, I wanted to be as prepared as I can, because I'm not going to pretend to know all this stuff. And as I mentioned in our intro, because of your Audi e-tron Quattro experience, I thought this would make sense. Plus all that Toyota F1 thing you did.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a funny situation actually, because they're talking about all of these new technologies and everything else that kind of we've been using for the last couple of years. And the Jerez test was just a few days ago, and obviously there was a few teams there struggled badly, and there was also a few of them that seemed to get into the stride. But I think there's also going to be a few of the drivers that will it'll probably favour them quite a lot, and there's some that won't as well.
Well, let's start with getting through a little bit of the new regulations and the new tech, but translate it eventually to what it's going to be like to drive these new cars. And at the simplest level, we've gone from normally aspirated to turbo. They don't want to call it engines anymore. It's some type of power system, because we don't have KERS, we have ERS, and we've got two type of ERS. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's energy recovery, which is basically coming through and helping with the turbo technologies. That's using exhaust gases and coming back in. And then there's the standard KERS, the kinetic energy recovery, which is under the braking system as well. Basically, they're trying to use all the old lost energies. And what that fundamentally means for the driver is that there is maybe a little bit less horsepower, pure horsepower, but there's a lot more torque. And so therefore the driver's got to be a little bit more adaptable on his throttle control. At the same time, they've reduced the aerodynamic downforce levels of the car quite significantly, which means that he's got less sort of car grip, and he's got a lot more engine power. And that means that there's, at this moment in time in the first test, there was a lot of sideways action coming out the corners. And the cars fundamentally were a lot slower. Now, I would say over the course of the next tests, the teams will start to understand it a little bit better. The drivers will understand how to drive it a little bit better. But they're going to have to do what we did back in 2006, when we went from the turbo gasoline-engined Audi R8 and to the diesel TDI turbo diesel R10, when we basically doubled our torque levels. And what we found was, when we were coming into corners, we had to brake straight, we had to turn, and we had to accelerate out straight. You couldn't carry the momentum through the corner the same way, because you couldn't hit the gas pedal with the same aggression, because you had just so much more there. And you had to then think about it. So we're feeding in the throttle a lot more, we were trying to balance the car a lot more. And the engineers had to think about how to put all of that torque onto the ground without using up the rear tyre. So there was a double-edged thing. The drivers had to adapt to that to try to be more conservative and smoother with their driving style, whereas the engineers had also the big problem of trying to get all that torque onto the ground.
So my plan has already gone out the window with good insight like that. So let me ask two quick questions. Number one, from a driver's standpoint, are there some F1 drivers that you think are going to struggle differently? Because it sounds like you're implying that someone who's quick corner in has to adapt or adjust.
Well, I think there is one big difference. With our diesel, then, that was a very heavy engine because it was a big V12. Now we're down to a V6 diesel on the R18, and with all of the energy recovery systems that we've been talking about, that changes things a little bit, but the torque system, that's still the same. I think you're right, though. Some drivers will probably attune to this driving style, and especially when it gets into the races, when you have to think about the fuel conservation, when you get to the races where really you have to think about that. And I would say, like to Jenson Button, this could be a real year for Jenson, because he's a very smooth driver. He's someone that is very delicate on his steering inputs and his throttle inputs as well, and someone that generally doesn't use a heck of a lot of fuel. Now, if he's got a good McLaren underneath him, he could be a real strong card. And his teammate, by chance, little Magnussen, Jan's son, Jan we know from all of the racing in the US of A, and he came out quickest at the first test, and that just proves he's got the speed, which we all kind of knew anyway, because his dad wasn't exactly a slow shoe, was he? He was a pretty fast shoe. And, Jan has produced another little Magnussen, Kevin, who is his own man, but he, I would say, drives it a little bit harder, but he's getting the lap time out of the car right now. So, there's two contrasting styles, but both able to do it. I would say if somebody that's got to probably adapt, I would think it's probably the more aggressive style of driver, the guy that just throws it out and rags it on a qualifying lap. And they're the ones that maybe will have to tune it back in for the race. But they had to do that a little bit last year. They're learning to do it with the tyre conservation, but it's a big extension from there to what they'll need in 2014.
So the second question becomes engineering, as you implied, and setup.
Yeah.
Can you, with all this torque, do you dial the car in with a little more push because you really got to throttle it?
You got to be careful with that.
Okay.
Because if you've got understeer, if you've got push, the car's slow.
Okay.
And ultimately, you've got that balance between the agility, the needing the nose onto the car to be able to turn and to then get it out the corner. If you're putting the power down and all that torque when you've got a lot of steering angle, then that's going to eat up the rear tires as well. Really, what you've got to do is to be able to, when you put that throttle down, to transfer all of that power through the drivetrain system and onto the ground. My dad told me this when I was about 12 or 13 in karting. He says, doesn't matter how much horsepower, son, if it doesn't go onto the ground, it's wasted. If you're wheel spinning, it is wasted horsepower. And so therefore, you've got to get round that. Some teams naturally have very good traction in their car, and they don't really know why. And other teams struggle a little bit. And again, they don't really know why. The critical thing is the ones that do understand how they get it and how they get it working. And right now, my bet's on Red Bull for that, because they've always seemed to understand how they get the car to work.
So here comes the other part of the regulations that involves fuel. I think the fuel capacity is reduced to 100 kilos from maybe 160. And there's something going on with fuel flow that implies that you're going to have to drive a fuel management race, which I'm thinking is a little bit in your domain from what you've been doing in your Le Mans racing. So how does that translate?
That's true. You've got a maximum amount of fuel for the race of 100 kilograms of fuel. Now, that's in pounds, it's 2.2, so it's 220 pounds of weight of fuel. And that basically means that in some races you can pretty much go flat out, but in other races you'll have to do big lift-offs. That certainly is the case for us. There's no question about it. There's races, I remember Laguna 2006, where for the last hour and 50 minutes I was fuel saving like mad, coming down out the corkscrew, shifting up to third very, very early, and then just coasting down through the left-hander, down into turn one. As soon as I got to the top of the hill at Laguna, I was lifting off and letting the car coast into the corner. And that's not a natural driving style for me. It was something that I had to really work at. And it's also something you've got to try and keep the tyres warm and try to keep the car loaded in the correct way, so that as much as you're lifting off in the straights, you're not lifting off in the corner. You still got the speed through and into the corner. And that does take a little bit of tuning. To be honest with you, Leo, the man to speak to about that is Tom Christensen, because Tommy boy, he still was the best at the fuel economy. Even right to their last race in Bahrain for us, he was the one that was still able to get the lap time with the fuel economy.
So are we going to be driving Lewis Hamilton nuts, where he's instead of saying I'm driving as slow, I'm sucking fuel as slow as I can? What is he going to have a problem?
Yeah, I think, well, Lewis was one of the guys I was thinking about actually a little while ago. You know, how's he going to adapt to this? Because Lewis, without doubt, in my mind, in Formula One, is the guy that can get a qualifying lap together like no other. He has got more pure speed in that body than you could ever imagine. And in a car that, well, you could call it a dog at times, he drags it out and he puts it on pole position. Now, come the race, that's a different matter, and we saw that his teammate Nico Rosberg sometimes had the legs on him, and Lewis, you know, that call he made in Barcelona to say, I cannot drive any slower, was like a knife through my heart. I can't, you know, it's a horrible thing to hear for a driver to say that to his engineer, and being asked by his engineer to drive even slower. Now, this year, that's going to be probably a little bit further than what it was in 2013, so I think Lewis definitely will have to adapt to it, but if the Mercedes is reliable and fast at the first few races, I'm pretty sure with his talent he'll get his head around it.
Let's go to the last three things on the new regulations, and you touched on a couple of them, but I got to ask first on weight. The cars are heavier to accommodate this new technology. Can you feel 48 kilos?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, when you're talking about the weight, you can feel 48 kilos over a 925 kilo sports car. Never mind when you're talking about something at 600 kilos, you know, which is basically, you know, two-thirds of the weight. 45 kilos roughly in Barcelona, a circuit I just mentioned before, that would be just over 1 second in lap time if you had to lug an extra 45 kilos. You know, we're talking about nearly 100 pounds of weight. If you stick 100 pounds of weight in your street car and you thrash it around the circuit, and if you stick it in the trunk, you'll feel it without question. So in a hybrid, thoroughbred racing car, then you're definitely going to feel it.
So thank you for the clarity, and I've allowed the internet to go nuts on me asking the stupid question of will you feel 100 pounds, but let me go to the next one, because we talked about...
Tell you what, if it's 100 Scottish pounds in money, then there's no question you'd feel it underneath your pocket.
Oh, we're back to the invoice again? Jesus. Okay.
That was all of the invoices together for you, Leo. Don't worry. It wasn't just a singular one.
So the other one is the Pirelli tire. If I understand what we're reading, they've gone to a harder compound because we're going to be busy going slow, saving fuel. The tire is different now too, right?
Well, the tires got to change because with an increase in torque the way they've had, there is no way you could keep the same tire construction and compound. It wouldn't work. And they were in Bahrain just right before Christmas testing. And they did still have some problems, but I was speaking to one of the engineers, funnily enough, just by chance at the airport on the way back through, and he was pretty confident they knew where to go. They had a problem, but they were sure they knew the solution. Now, I hope so, because they had a difficult year last year. They did turn up to some races and the tyres just weren't quite strong enough. Silverstone's the one that sticks in everybody's mind. But, you know, I do feel for them a little bit, because without testing, it's difficult to be able to predict what's going to happen. And they needed to be out testing. So they did a little bit before Christmas in Bahrain. And they've been obviously testing to Jerez, which was kind of, it was a test, but it was more of a shakedown, I would have said, for quite a lot of the teams. And I would expect them to be in a better shape when they get to Melbourne. But the real test is going to be later on when they get to the European season, when the teams have all got their aero packages sorted out, where they've got the chassis sorted out, and where they're putting real load through the tyres.
And I'm going to spare us the conversation about making jokes about the noses of the cars, but I'm going to talk about aero and ask you a question. I agree with you that everyone's going to start clawing back aerodynamics, but right now we've narrowed the front wing. There's no beam wing in the back. Although McLaren's got that little tricky mushroomy thing going on.
Isn't it?
Isn't that cool? No blown exhausts. a bigger DRS opening, but it sounds like the aero is going to be affected. Where will it influence the lap of a race, or the lap running the car? High-speed corners everywhere. What am I missing here?
A little bit of everything. Aero works everywhere. Obviously, it works more at higher speeds.
Okay.
But even at low speeds, you do get aero effect. And the McLaren, little trick at the back of the car, that's quite cute. And I do like that, because that's what new regulations offer up, is a little loophole for teams to exploit. And that's definitely the way they've done at the moment. It's quite difficult, apparently, for the other teams to be able to copy it as well. It's not just a 5-minute thing to be able to achieve that, but I'm sure there's a lot of guys back in the wind tunnel straight away and on the CAD-CAM systems trying to get that sorted out. Now, when we're talking about the aero, I think from a driving point of view, if you've got a lot of aero, then you can lift off and you can run speed into the corner. And so therefore you can maybe gain some of the lost lap time that you would have by lifting off the throttle, say 150 yards early to conserve fuel. Whereas if you don't have that downforce, then you're kind of just sort of slithering into the corner more than anything else. And then as well, it doesn't put load through the tyre, but it means that when you put the throttle down, then you've got a bit less grip. And so therefore the tyre is to work more coming out of the corner as opposed to going in.
I don't want to bounce around, but I want to go back to something much, much earlier. When we're in fuel management mode, how do you do that? Are you reading a predictive on the dash? Are you listening to someone in...
Different teams, different ways.
Okay.
Basically, they're going to have a predictive on the dash, and then it's going to be a very fast update. And they're also going to have engineers shouting at them if they're going too far away from it. The sports car regulation for 2014 is much more strict insofar as you've got your energy amount of usage per lap, and if you go 2% above it, then you can get a stop-go penalty straight away. And so therefore, that's a pretty strict rule to adhere to. That isn't there in Formula One. And so they'll just have engineers bleating down the radio at them, trying to get them to lift off and cool back. I don't think, Leo, we're going to see cars running out of fuel like we did in Long Beach in '82, when they were really into the fuel with the turbo era and things like that. That's not going to happen, because technology and data is significantly further down the line than it was back then. We would never be talking to each other from Bonnie, Scotland and the United States of America back in '82 with video picture conferencing, would we? But it's not going to be the same thing, but you are going to have a lot of feedback to the driver, whether it be visual in the cockpit or whether it be from the pits, on his energy usage.
And I guess the last thing to put in the hands and the controls of the driver, 8 gears versus 7, no DRS, no KERS button, because it's all going to be electronically managed, and with the foot,
should be.
As it should be. And like you said much earlier, we went from 750 horsepower with the ICE engine and what was it, 80 horsepower from KERS for 6 seconds to now 600 horsepower on the engine, 160 horsepower on the ERS systems, and 33 seconds of basically that boost over a course of a lap.
Yep.
This is a test for me. Did I get that right?
Yeah, basically you did. Now,
go ahead.
When you're talking about using that 33 seconds, because you're going to use it all as quickly as you can, and the base area is going to be out of the corners, because that's when you get the maximum extra acceleration where you can use it down the straights. And so, on most circuits, the 33 seconds should be enough to get to a decent terminal velocity and to get them up there. I think there'll be some tracks where they'll have to sort of play it a little bit for sure, but it should be automatic, because the drivers were doing a heck of a lot in the cockpit that they didn't actually need to do. We've had it automatic in sports cars for quite a long time, and so I'm a bit surprised that they didn't. They had to manually, activate it. The DRS is opening a little bit further, and that is to try to reduce some drag even further, to try to make overtaking a little bit easier again. Some circuits, it was too easy already. Some circuits, it wasn't. But it did make overtaking something my father hates. He thinks it's just wrong. A driver should have to muscle his way past. He should have to show that he's quicker than the other guy, not just flick a button, open a flap, and then blast past him. But then again, on the other side of it, the sports fan side of it, then I have to say that I think it actually worked quite well. Admittedly, some tracks it needed to be tuned, but as a general principle, if you blasted past someone because you had DRS open, then he always had the opportunity to follow you down into the next DRS opportunity and then blast past you. And if he couldn't stay within that time period to be able to do it, then that was his fault as far as I was concerned.
Well, all I'll say is here in the 50s, we had a TV show called Father Knows Best. I'm on your dad's side.
Hey, all I can say is having been 44 years with him telling me that he knows best, then I can probably agree with you.
Let's do a quick run through some of the teams, just to get your sense of what to expect, and if it's not too much of a push to be predictive, if you think they're going to go up in the standings or down in the standings. And I'll kickstart it with right from the top. Infiniti Red Bull Racing. Yes, Renault has their little glitch problems. They've, Newey's done his thing aerodynamically again. There's probably something more going on in the back of the car. They've got Ricciardo now with Vettel, but I would argue vehemently that if they're not fighting for the championship, then, I should pee in the cup because I'm doing drugs saying otherwise. What do you think about them?
I think they're going to be hard to beat. They're one of the front-running teams, have been dominant for the last 4 years, even though they've had a problem at the first test, done 21 laps over 4 days, which basically means 21 installation laps.
Yeah.
Then I would say by the time we get to Europe, they'll be back on song, whatever their problem is. The one thing, though, is they consistently have had more problems with cars than probably any other team. Now, cars is a bigger factor in your performance now. So if they have a problem with cars now, then I don't think it's a case of just trying to reboot it, restart it, or still stay out at the front and win the race and talk about it at the press conference. I don't think that'll happen. I think that'll be dropping down the order. So they've got to really get that sorted out. But anyone that bets against them, I don't think you get good odds on it.
It prompts a little side question, and I don't want to get into too many details and mathematical permutations, but Alonso, for example, in a year has always said, well, I'm still in the fight, even when it seems... How far can you go as Infiniti Red Bull Racing struggling before you realize, holy shit, this season's over? Is it halfway? Is there something there where you kind of know the fight's over?
Well, I think 2014 is very different to 2013. 2013, a lot of teams jumped ship early and started working on the 2014 car because it was such a big departure on regulations. Now we've got reasonably stable regs for a wee while. And so I think that any work that's done in 2014 to improve the car is going to be carried over into 2015. And so therefore I think that'll be a later date. But what drivers say, what team bosses say, and what's in their heart of hearts sometimes are not quite the same thing. Now, I obviously told you the truth every single time when we were doing our interviews when I was driving. There was no questions about that, 100%. But I'm just looking for lightning bolts actually coming down. But yeah, you should move. But the facts are that I think you get to sort of maybe 5-6 races from the end, and you know whether it's going to come with you or not. Alonso's got one skill, though. He manages just to keep everybody at Ferrari feeling that little bit better about themselves. And part of his, I would say, mental games are, yeah, we're out of the championship, we've got no chance, when other people think he's still in. Or alternatively, as he did a couple of years ago, he said, we're still in the fight. And remember, at Silverstone, he said, we're in the fight for this World Championship. And I honestly thought the guy had gone nuts.
Yeah.
He was nowhere near it, but he was right. They were in the fight right to the end.
So let me jump ship. We'll talk about Mercedes right after this. Finish your thoughts on Ferrari. We've got Kimi and Alonso. It feels put up or shut up for Ferrari.
Yep.
What are you thinking?
Yes, I agree. Because they basically have had a good car and done not so well with it in 2013, had a bad car in 2012 and done really well with it. But it was always this little well ifs and buts and ands and ups and downs. Facts are they've got to win a world championship. They've got Kimi back who will bring consistent points, very different of Kimi of old. He's pretty motivated, but he also doesn't make very many mistakes. He brings the car home every single time. He's guaranteed points base. And then I still believe they've got Fernando to go for the title. Now, there was a bit of to and fro at the end of last year about Fernando leaving, Fernando this, De Montezemolo not being happy with Fernando. That's just a lover's tiff. The fact is, those guys are thick as thieves, and There's nothing Fernando wants to do more than win a championship with Ferrari. And there's nothing Di Montezemolo wants more than Alonso to do that with Ferrari.
So Ferrari finished P3 in the manufacturers. Do you predict them stepping up?
Yes.
Who finished P2 was Mercedes AMG, Hamilton and Rosberg. What do you think?
Well, I think losing Ross Brawn will be a change to them, because Ross was not just part of the Mercedes from the start. He was part of the Brawn era from before, and he was also part of the Honda era from before that. And so therefore he knows that team, he knows those people inside out. And you can't just take that character, not the engineer, the character out of it, and expect it to continue without any sort of bumps on the road. Now, I think Toto Wolff is extremely good. And I think Toto is a very clever man that will be able to manage those. But I still think they will miss Ross. They've got a lot of very clever people, and they've got a lot of people that will be sort of, I would say, elbowing themselves for their new positions. And therefore, unless they've got a really good car at the beginning, which they appear to have actually, then I think it will be a tough fight for them. You know, when I said Ferrari up, my immediate thought was, Christ, well, who's got to go down? Because you've got Red Bull, you've got Ferrari, and you've got Mercedes. And those, to me, are the three main top runners, with a McLaren as an interloper, if you like. But Mercedes, I think, have got to step forward from where they were last year, which was fast but fragile.
I'm going to ask you about McLaren, and then we'll ask for a blanket statement about who to watch on the rest. It feels like McLaren's in another one of those put up or shut up moments.
Even more than anyone else.
Okay.
Without doubt, even more. You know, Ron Dennis is back at the helm. They've got Eric Boullier coming in as basically racing director, I think is his official title. Now, Eric, I really rate highly. I think as a person, he's a gentle giant with an iron fist. And he's someone that can really work with drivers and get the best out of them. I really rate him a lot. And I think he's going to be a big loss to Lotus, but he's going to be a big addition to McLaren. Now, Ron, to me, will bring back that sort of direction that they maybe lost in the past, because it's his backside on the line. This is his team. Whatever anybody else thinks, whatever any shareholder thinks, this is Ron's team, because he was the one that got it out of bankruptcy. He was the one that dragged it forward. He was the one that put it to where it is today. And he still feels it's his team, and someone else was playing with it, and now he's back at the top. And I think they'll benefit from that. They do have to put up or shut up, because ultimately nobody remembers who was second last year, and nobody certainly remembers where McLaren ended up. And I think they've got a good chance to do it. Now, right now, they've got a young guy in Magnussen that we've spoken about, and they've got an older guy in Button that we've also spoken about. So they've sort of hedged their bets on both ends, somebody with experience and somebody with youth. Somebody with experience that can drive these cars, and somebody that just doesn't have any other thing to identify to, so he'll learn all the way, whatever it happens to be. And that, I think, is actually quite a clever move. So I would expect them to move forward, but I'm not sure whether it's going to be enough to fight for the title.
So I'm going to set up the last question of who to watch for by giving myself a little audience. Who to watch, I mentioned McLaren in my mind. Magnussen for sure. Not just because of Jan.
Yep.
Massa to watch over at Williams, Caterham and Kobayashi, and then Toro Rosso fascinates me. Of the other teams, whether I'm right or wrong, who cares? Who are you watching as?
Well, you mentioned two of them. Williams, I think, is definitely one that's going to make moves forward. Pat Simmons went there last year, and Pat was, he basically, for all you fans in America, you might maybe not remember, there was a chap called Frank Durney went there back in the early 2000s when Juan Montoya was there. And Frank went there to stabilize the ship, to give a guidance, to give an experience to all these young engineers that had a lot of talent, but not necessarily the experience and knowledge. And that is exactly what Pat Simmons is doing now. And there's a lot more experienced guys going in. They'll be a team on the march. Watch Massa, re-energized, out of Ferrari, into something fresh. I would say he's going forward. Kvyat at Toro Rosso is another one. I've watched him in Formula 3. That boy's quick. You know, that boy is really quick. And I'll be interested to see how he sort of gets up with Verne, because Verne I rate as a talent, but I think he needs a bit more mental strength to be able to duke it out in Formula 1, which is probably why he didn't get the Red Bull seat. was maybe 1 year too early. But Verne's got to prove himself. Kvyat will prove himself, I'm very sure. The whole Lotus situation looks a little bit fragile for me. I've got to say, I think their best days in 2013 probably won't be replicated in 14, but I hope I'm proved wrong. I really, really do. And one guy that's not racing, but I'm intrigued how he does on Fridays, is Robert Frins. You mentioned Kobayashi there at Caterham. The test driver's Robert Frins. Now, that kid won in Formula Renault, won the championship, straight out in the back, bang, won it. Then he went to 3.5, won that straight out the back, won it. Then he went to GP2, and he only had 2 or 3 races because he had no budget. And he won the first race straight out the back, bang. And so everything he's touched, he's won. But he's never got himself in a Formula 1 race seat for some reason. But this could be his opportunity to show on a Friday. And I expect him to be very, very fast when he does. So he's on the sidelines, but you'll have to dig deep to watch him. But just watch the name Frins.
I really appreciate your time. When does the BBC work start for you? Or
tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. No, it's the first race is obviously in Melbourne. That's the first time we go. But you know, when watching Jerez and then also got Bahrain coming up for the next test, then it's really, really cool to see, you know, who's sort of putting down the first markers. You know, at the end of the day, I would have said the Mercedes engine teams put down the first marker so far. Renault are going back to scratch their heads to try and fix all of their problems. I'm sure they will. Those are talented guys there. And then we'll see what really happens when we get to Bahrain. And that will give us a much better indicator for the first few races, Melbourne, Malaysia, and China and co.
I like what we discussed because I fear sometimes car fans think it's all about the car technology or all about the driver gritting it out. But in our conversation, you kind of put it all in perspective. This really is a management process. This really is the balancing of humanity and technology, and someone's got to lead the ship to get the most out of everything. It seems to be something that maybe sometimes gets forgotten on who is successful and who is not.
I think it's going to be quite an intriguing season. And it's not going to be about qualifying and who's fastest, which is still one part of it. It's still a part that we love, you know, just going out there and ragging that car and giving everything it's got. But on the other side of it, you're going to have a lot of investment of time and energy from a lot of people behind the scenes, the faceless people in the team, if you like, but the ones that will deserve a lot of credit at the end of the year because they will bring one driver the World Championship.
But do you predict that this will still be F1 and it will not be boring?
Yes.
Thank you.
Because it always has been. It's changed, it's evolved, and it's easy to look back in rose-tinted glasses and say, oh, I remember the beautiful old turbo era of the 80s. Yeah, we don't remember the cars breaking down all the time. We don't remember some of them not even getting out the pit lane. We don't remember the fact that I was looking at a Spa video from a few years ago, and the difference between sort of third and fourth in the race and fifth and sixth was 4 seconds per lap. You know, and those times have gone. It's much more competitive than it's ever been. The average quality is much higher, and I would have said that it's going to be a really good 2014 because we never know, but we might get a non-Red Bull victory at the end of the season. That's one thing I certainly would predict this year. There's a good chance of that.
Thank you.
That's as far as I can go at the moment, Leo, to be honest. That's the one test. That's as far as I'm going.
We quite appreciate it. Thank you. See you later.
Pleasure. By the way, the next invoice is in the post.
Good
Hope
job.
the checks come in the other way.
Good job. JF?
Thanks.
Okay, we got it.